Hello, good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Rishi Sunak is at the G7 in Japan, facing questions about China, support for Ukraine and the details of a speed awareness course last year. He didn't seem best pleased to be quizzed on whether his Home Secretary asked civil servants to organise a private course after she was caught speeding last year, and what Labour say could be a breach of the ministerial code. The man who promised a government of integrity has already lost 3 cabinet ministers in the 7 months he's been in charge. So we'll be trying to get to the bottom of it all on the show today. Will our first guest be able to shed any light? In just a moment, we'll hear from the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. And for Labour, we'll talk to the Shadow Health Minister and one-time leadership candidate, Liz Kendall. We'll also be joined this morning by the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands and the former John Lewis boss, Andy Street. Sir Anthony Seldon is a renowned historian. He's been a university vice-chancellor. He's now head of Epsom College, and he's been warning about the threat to education from AI. He'll join us live. Plus, there's not much that Baroness Martha Lane Fox hasn't done in the world of business. She founded lastminute.com. She's now president of the British Chambers of Commerce, and she will be our guest later. Well, let's start this morning, shall we, with the government. The environment brief is particularly in the news at the minute, given the focus on the water industry and the state of our rivers and beaches. So this week, we are talking to the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. I started by asking about the Prime Minister at the G7. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. It's been a big day in the G7. We've just been hearing from Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. At the same time, Russia claiming victory in Bakhmut in Ukraine. What's your understanding of the situation on the ground?
Well, I'm conscious that the President of Ukraine is with the G7 at the moment and has been there to continue that international resilience and also against the oppression of Putin in invading Ukraine, which of course has had a devastating impact on that country, but the economic consequences as well around the rest of the world. So I think it's right that the UK committed to sending long-distance missiles. It's great news that President Biden has agreed to be training the pilots, providing the airplanes. So all these things come together to show that the world is united against Putin.
Rishi Sunak's also said that China poses the biggest challenge, in his words, of our age to global security and prosperity, increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad. How big a problem is China?
Well, I think China is now being one of the largest economies in the world. It's that careful steps that we need to take with them in terms of recognising this isn't about a decoupling situation, but working closely with them. But that's also why we took decisions, for example, to remove Huawei from our 5G network, conscious of the concerns about possible espionage and different ways that other activities could happen that would support the Chinese regime. But I think it's critical that we continue to make sure we have our eyes wide open. That's why we opened our doors to people coming from Hong Kong to have permanent residency here in the UK when changes were happening in Hong Kong. And it's that sort of element where I think we need to, as I say, tread a careful step with them.
OK, thank you. I'm keen to talk about some domestic issues now, if I may. Is it true that the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, asked civil servants to arrange a private speed awareness course after she was caught speeding?
Well, I've only read the newspapers like your good self. I haven't got any extra information not aware of any further details on that. It's perfectly normal nowadays if people are found speeding to be offered points or to go on a course of some kind. So, as I say, I don't know the details that are referred to in the newspaper. But I think, as far as I'm aware, the Home Secretary's just decided to take the points, pay the penalty and keep focused on her main job of security, but also tackling illegal migration.
Do you have the Home Secretary's phone number?
Do I have her phone number? I probably do somewhere.
Why didn't you message her then?
Well, because I think it's a case of there's some speculation in the newspaper. I'm not going to get into individual details. As far as I'm aware, there's people close to the message or whoever, the press. But, you know, candidly, this is just a case of something that happened, I guess, over a year ago. I don't quite know the details. I can only read I'm only aware of what was in the newspaper.
Do you get why viewers might find it a bit frustrating that ministers can come on and say, look, I don't know the details, I've got nothing to say on this because I just don't know, when, you know, it's obvious that we're going to ask about this question, right?
Well, I only read the newspapers myself probably about 20 minutes ago, so I'm just scanning through what was...
Well, it's on the front page of two of them.
Well, indeed.
It's not like it's a kind of page 32 buried lead.
Indeed, Sophie, but as I say, people every day get offered the joys of taking points or doing a course.
Of course.
There's more there about how perhaps having a one-to-one course.
The issue isn't whether or not she does the course. No one would raise an eyebrow if she was caught speeding and did a course. The issue is the allegation that she asked civil servants to try and get her a private speed awareness course. I mean, that's clearly not in the remit of what civil servants are supposed to do, is it?
Well, I think it's a case of reading that it was decided that civil servants shouldn't get involved in that. That's the details that I just don't have, Sophie, and I don't make it my business to go around phoning people at 7:20 in the morning when I've just read a bit of newspaper to look into this.
Do you not? Do you just don't think it's a big deal if it's true then? Because you seem to be quite relaxed about it. It is a big deal, isn't it? If she's asking the taxpayer-funded civil service to get involved in her personal affairs. I
think that what I've said is I've scanned the newspapers myself this morning before coming on the show. I'm not in the business of phoning people at about 7:20 in the morning to try and get chapter and verse from a
Or even if they might have broken the ministerial code.
I
might
think,
be worth a message, surely.
Well, I mean, you're making all sorts of allegations. There's different elements. I mean, I'm just not aware of the details, Sophie. And as I say, at the same time, is clear is that Luella now has those 3 points in her licence and she's getting on with the job about tackling particularly illegal migration, but also the wider security elements of our country.
I'm just trying to get the facts, though. I'm not really making allegations because I don't know what happened. That's why I'm trying to find out. You know, her spokesperson saying she accepts she was speeding last summer and regrets doing so. She took the 3 points and paid the fine last year. I mean, that is answering a completely different question. The question is, did she ask civil servants to get involved in what many would see to be an abuse of power? Well,
you've read the same things that I've read in the newspaper as well this morning. I don't have any more details than that, and it's not for me to start speculating about what did or didn't happen.
OK, I'm not really sure what to say, to be honest. OK, that's the position. OK. The timing of the leak or the story is also quite interesting. It's not going to be an easy week for the Home Secretary with net migration figures coming out, expected to have gone up significantly. Could net migration hit a record-breaking 700,000?
Well, again, I'm not going to speculate on what statistics may be coming. I think there are two key points that I'd like to make, which are that since leaving the European Union, we now control, through an Australian-style points-based system, the criteria for people coming into this country who don't already have the opportunity to do so. We've also opened our doors to people from Hong Kong, from Ukraine, in really difficult circumstances. So the point is, the rules are there if we decide that we want to change the rules in the future. But overall, the Prime Minister has been clear. He wants to reduce overall numbers on legal migration, but the main focus right now is actually on tackling the illegal immigration. That's why he was in Iceland last week at the Council of Europe, making the case about what we're doing with our illegal migration bill, but also that new deal working with Frontex, the European Union's body, to make sure not only around the Channel, but of course people coming into Europe in the first place. So, you know, a new partnership has been forged there, which is really good news in trying to stop illegal migration overall. I'm
keen to stick to legal migration, if I may. Let's just have a look at what the current situation is, because it really has been going up at a rate of knots recently. I mean, you can see here the absolute spike in net migration to the UK, over 500,000. As you say, Rishi Sunak says he wants to bring that number down. He thinks it's too high. So how are you going to do that?
Well, I think one of the things, as I've indicated, we've already seen a significant number. I think it's well over 100,000 people coming from Ukraine. There's also tens of thousands of people who've come from Hong Kong and still have the opportunity.
How are you going to bring that number down?
But in terms of, I think will be a case that the Home Office will have been analysing the different sources of what's been people who've come in. You know, we deliberately have this focused on skills. We deliberately have this focused on people wanting to come to this country and fill key gaps that we need help with now, but also a significant element of this is also about our world-leading universities and about how people want to come and study here as well. So there's a combination of factors, and it really is for the Home Office to analyse and suggest different ways on how we might want to tackle that in the future.
It is, of course, for the Home Office, but your view matters as well, right? Because I think the whole point of this is it's quite hard to get some of this stuff through Cabinet because people have different views on how far you should go in trying to bring some of those numbers down. So the Sunday Telegraph obviously briefed this morning that the Home Secretary wants to curb student visas by reducing the 2 years that people can stay after they graduate. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Well, also being in Cabinet means we have collective responsibility, Sophie. So it's not about personal views. It's about taking that overall approach on what it is. The Prime Minister's set a clear priority about stopping boats to stop illegal migration. But he's also I was about to say, but he's also made clear, especially reinforced it over the weekend, about how we bring those numbers down.
So how do you bring them? That's literally the question I'm asking. How do you bring those numbers down?
Well, I think that the Home Office is working on that sort of analysis right now.
Like, can you see? That's not really. I mean, you're not really answering what I'm trying to get. Like, what?
I understand, Sophie, but I can't talk about policy that isn't yet policy of government. So at the moment,
we just have to take it on word then that the numbers will come down magically because the Prime Minister said that.
No, I think you've shown me numbers from last year. I think seeing that increase, some of that can be explained, as I say, by the number of people coming from Hong Kong and Ukraine. Also about different skills.
Sure. Well, let's have a look at
that for policy that isn't just, frankly, well not decided within government. I then can't go into speculation about what it may or may not be.
Let's have a look at the breakdown, shall we? Because you're right, there's different elements of this. The blue line at the bottom there is Hong Kong and Ukraine, which, as you say, has gone up. But then, of course, the lighter blue line above that is people in work, and that orange line at the top is students. So as you can see, that is the breakdown. Let's talk about something that is a bit more in your remit then. Hopefully you might be able to get a bit more guidance on that. Work visas, obviously, as you can see from the chart, big part of net migration. Your department promised farmers up to 55,000 visas for fruit pickers next year. The Home Secretary says there's no good reason we can't train fruit pickers at home. So where is that argument at? Have you had some difficult conversations with the Home Secretary about it?
Well, the farming industry quite regularly relied on people coming in from other parts of the European Union, potentially further, to do this sort of work. And since we've left the European Union, millions of people have gained EU settlement status, but of course we've had COVID. And quite a lot of people who were in the UK went back to their countries across Europe and haven't necessarily come back. So it was important to try and fill that gap. That's why the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme was started. First of all, it was quite a small number, and we listened to this sector, and that's why we have the 45,000 number this year with potential for an extra 10,000. Now, at the Food and Farm to Fork Summit last week, we gave the certainty for next year that we'd have the same numbers available, because one of the things that farmers have said to us is that they want to be able to plan ahead. And so it's a balance between what's going on with automation and the investment in that. But indeed, I want to, when I was at DWP, at Local Jobs Centre, we tried to put farmers together with people seeking work. And so there's a variety of ways that we want to try and do that. But in the short term, I think certainly having that certainty for next year was very much welcomed by farming industry.
I just want to kind of zoom out for a minute because, you know, for many people...
Can I just point out those numbers don't count towards the migration because people are here for 6 months. Okay. So it's literally seasonal worker and then people go home.
No, it's an important point. Just to sort of zoom out for a minute, you know, for many people, the rising numbers of net migration that the PM says he wants to bring down is a sign that the government is out of control. You haven't got control of these numbers.
Well, I think we do have the control because we've set the rules, and you've seen there the biggest increase by far.
So you must be comfortable then with the higher numbers.
Well, the biggest increase so far has been the number of people coming to study here. Now, our universities are very keen to have people coming from around the world. We also see it as a great way to potentially attract talent. If it's easier to go and study in the USA or elsewhere, at the same time, while we have, I think it's 4 of the top 10 universities in the world by international rankings, it's critical that we try and make sure that people have access to that excellence. Because some of these things are about building relationships, not only in the short term, but in the longer term. And Britain's always been an outward-looking country. One of the things is about, as I say, the increase that's particularly happened with students, but also with Ukraine and Hong Kong.
Another example that some people may say is a government that's not in control is sewage in your department. Dirty rivers, dirty beaches, 300,000 spill events in England last year. Is the situation acceptable?
Well, I don't think it's acceptable, but that's why the water companies are already under a criminal investigation. And that investigation was initiated, I think it was last year. There's also investigations being done by the economic regulators. So together, the Environment Agency and Ofwat have got that combined investigation.
Are you angry towards the water companies?
I have to say I'm pretty fed up with the water companies, and we've seen an apology this week, which is the right thing for them to have done. I think what's important is to make sure that we have a plan, and we set out a plan for water to try and tackle these issues. And let's just bear in mind, people didn't know about these things until it was just over a decade ago. It was a Conservative minister, Richard Benyon, who initiated that we were going to start making sure all these sites were monitored. All of that will be completed by the end of the year, and that information is publicly available.
I guess some people must say, look, you've got a plan, but is it enough? And water companies have to improve storm overflows, that effectively allows them to discharge this sewage into our waterways to avoid them going into homes, but not until 2035. I mean, you can't wait 10 years to have a swim.
Well, there's a combination, and by the way, our bathing waters are cleaner than ever before. So in terms of, we've seen an increase...
It's not a great situation. You said it's not an acceptable situation.
Well, what I'm saying to you, though, is the water is cleaner than it was in 2010. So 93% of our bathing waters are excellent or good. That's an increase from about 70% in 2010. That's taken ongoing investment to make that happen. But in terms of things like the storm overflows, we are dealing with a Victorian network. This is where you have also combined sewers taking not only stuff coming out of your homes, but stuff out of rainwater. Up until the 60s, that is the sort of investment that needs to be fixed, as well as the storm overflows. But it's why I insisted that by the end of next month, every single storm overflow has to have an action plan on my desk, and we will go through that.
And what happens if it's not good enough? What will you do?
We will go back and make sure through our different regulators that gets fixed.
OK.
But in terms of the 10 billion that was announced last week by Water UK, that's welcome. But I have to say, it's similar to what we were expecting as part of our overall £56 billion storm reduction overflow plan. But these things do take time. We're right by the Thames. The Thames.
But it's bill payers, isn't it? Not the companies who are going to be paying that money, right?
Well, I was just going to talk about the scale. If we're sat right by the Thames right here, that project started about a decade ago. It's still not finished. It's a huge investment, but that will radically reduce the sewage.
It's bill payers who will be picking up the tab for this, right?
Well, we've had record amounts of investment into that.
Is that yes or no? It is yes, right?
Through different ways. It's going to be a combination, of course, penalties and fines are paid for by the company, not by the bill payer. But in terms of general payments, I think you're right to say that a lot of this investment gets repaid through by bills and a small amount of return. But I think in the time that Labour was in power, 97 to 2010, over £30 billion was paid out in dividends. In terms of the last decade, what's happening and what's going forward, the dividends will be significantly lower than what had happened in the past.
Well, should there be dividends at all? Should there be making profits and making money at a time when bill payers are the ones who are having to pay for what the awful... what has happened before?
Well, one of the things that Ofwat does is to make sure that any investments are deemed to be good value for money. One of the things that also the penalties can end up with reimbursements to customers. But I think it's critical to say that we are getting to grips with a situation that we have unveiled that scourge of sewage. And that's why our plans, I think, will be effective in getting these solutions fixed.
Now, you're announcing plans to strip out red tape in the wine sector. What's the idea?
So we've been looking at a variety of regulations from the European Union. At the moment, things like wine, they're governed by 400 pages of regulations. We think a lot of that can be stripped away and make sure that, frankly, this should produce potentially up to 50 pence off the cost of a bottle of wine. So it's about making sure we take advantage of the fact that we can set the regulations in the future, get rid of the bureaucracy and make sure not only our thriving vineyards at home, we've got about 800 of those now, can really take full advantage of the opportunities, but also reduce the red tape for some of the wine coming in from abroad too. So that's a good way to toast the forthcoming summer, and we'll get on with the regulations as quickly as we can.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Therese Coffey there, who hadn't seen the Suella Braverman story, we're led to believe, until shortly before the programme, so not really giving too much of a view on that one. Well, let's get the view from Labour now, shall we? I'm sure Liz Kendall, our next guest, may be a bit more forthcoming on the Suella Braverman situation. The party's also setting out its vision for the health service, which is struggling with the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and so we're going to talk now to the Shadow Health Minister, Liz Kendall. Thank you for being on the programme. You'll have seen the reports about Suella Braverman and whether or not she asked civil servants to arrange this private speed awareness course for her. What's your sort of reaction?
I think Rishi Sunak should launch an investigation into it. He should ask the independent advisor whether she's breached the standards of the ministerial code here. I think a lot of people watching this programme will think, you know, why is it always one rule for them and another rule for everybody else? But, you know, Suella Braverman's got form on this, hasn't she? You'll remember she actually had to resign as Home Secretary under Liz Truss because she sent confidential documents to a Tory MP when she shouldn't have done that. And Rishi Sunak reappointed her as Home Secretary. Why? Because he had to keep the right wing of his party on board. So there's no point in him getting all tetchy at the G7 press conference. It's because of him that she's there. So I've got my own views about that sort of behaviour, but actually what he should do is launch an investigation to make sure we get to the bottom of this and to see whether she has actually breached the ministerial code.
I mean, I guess what defenders of Suella Braverman might say is that there isn't really one rule for her and one for everyone else, because she did try to do the speed awareness course and then in the end ended up accepting the points on her licence.
But why did she ask civil servants? Don't forget, she's the Home Secretary, asking civil servants whether there should be a different arrangement that the rest of us have to have for her. Is that the highest standards of probity and integrity that we should rightly see from our ministers? I don't think it is, but actually what Sunak should do is launch that investigation.
We'll have more on the story, of course, as it develops, as the day goes on. The wider story when it comes to the Home Secretary, of course, is the net migration figures that we're expecting out next week. Rishi Sunak's been very clear. He says that he wants to bring net migration down from the current levels of around 500,000. He thinks it's too high. What's Labour's position? Is that too high and do you want to see it come down?
I expect it to come down, and it should come down. And I think the real issue here is this, that in Labour's points-based immigration system, we have to tie up what we're seeing in terms of a skills gap in our population and actually put in place the programmes to deal with that so that we don't have to have the work visas that we're seeing at the moment. I mean, just look at health and social care. That is the area where the highest number of visas are being issued at the moment. But what does the government do? It cuts medical school places this year by 3,000, denying opportunities for bright young Britons to have a fantastic job in our NHS. Social care, the government, we've just heard, has halved the funding it promised in its white paper for the social care workforce. So that is the wrong approach. Where we have skills gaps, Labour has said we will set up Skills for England to identify where those problems are and put in place those proper training programmes.
It's interesting to talk about the health sector and in terms of those migration figures, because, as you say, we do see a huge number of people coming from abroad to work in our health service, nurses, doctors, care workers. Is that a problem?
I think we should be doing more to make sure we have the proper training in this country.
And why is that? Is it because it's a risk to rely on people from abroad? Why is it?
Because I think it is a fantastic career and opportunity. I look in my own sector of social care. You know, care workers do some of the most important work in this country, looking after the people we love most, our elderly and disabled relatives. I think this is a huge area of growing demand in future. We know that our population is ageing, and I also think by having properly trained and paid care workers in every part of the country, that will make a huge contribution to our economy too. So let's champion that rather than undermine it.
Tomorrow, Keir Starmer's giving a speech on the NHS. He's going to say the NHS is not sustainable unless we make serious, deep, long-term changes. So what are the changes? What's the idea?
So when the NHS was created, average life expectancy was 63. Now it's 80, and 1 in 4 babies born today is set to live to 100. Back then, the major cause of death and disease was infectious diseases and accidents. Now it's long-term chronic conditions like cancer, heart disease and diabetes. A quarter of us are living with 2 long-term conditions or more, and a third of people who end up in A&E have 5 conditions or more. Our NHS is not set up to deal with those problems.
So what's the idea?
The big thing is to get the shift towards prevention, early intervention and more support in the community at home. It's about bringing together all these separate teams into one place. If you've ever had to deal with an elderly relative stuck in hospital, you have to battle your way around the system, ringing 5, 6, 7 people. What we need is one team to help keep people at home.
So when you talk about prevention, one of the things the levers of the government have is regulation. So taxes, for example, on sugar, more regulation around junk food. Is that what Labour would do?
We do want to see a ban on junk food advertising targeted at children and young people.
What about taxes on unhealthy food?
I think what we have seen with the sugar levy is that one of the things the government has done is that has made a difference. So we will be looking, and you'll forgive me for not making all the announcements today, you'll have to wait and see until the mission tomorrow. It is about shifting the focus towards prevention, but it's also about transforming those services.
If you're comfortable about making food more expensive at a time when people are really struggling to pay for food?
Actually, I've seen here in the past when Labour was in government that actually having a fair regulatory system where you are taking action on sugar and salt in people's foods did make a difference. But I would say to you too here, Sophie, it is about far more than that. It is about radically shifting the focus of services out of hospitals into the community, joining them up around the needs of patients and users, because that's what we need to live longer, healthier, more independent
I know we'll
lives.
get more details tomorrow. Always a slightly frustrating time
I'm sure
to do an interview,
it
to be
must
completely honest with you, as a result. Now, Keir Starmer says money's part of it, but it's not just about money. But money is a part of it as well. You're talking about social care, right? And big problem, the reason we've got so many vacancies in social care is that you can earn more money working at supermarkets. So why would you stay in social care?
Can I just come back on
Labour say they want a national care service with as much ambition as the 1945 NHS. Realistically, is Labour looking at putting up taxes in order to fund some of the changes?
No, and can I just come back to you on that point? I actually used to say the same. It is true that you can earn more working in supermarket or hospitality, but actually a third of people, 1 in 3 who leave the care workforce actually go and work for the NHS.
OK.
So we need a joined-up workforce plan there.
But I'm talking seriously here about money, right? Because you're talking about you're talking about 1945-style reformation of a national care service. You're talking about chronic staffing shortages. Are you looking at potentially wealth taxes? The reason I'm asking this is back in 2021, Keir Starmer was asked how he would fund an increase in social care funding. He says those that earn their money in ways other than work should pay their own share. People who earn their money from properties, dividends, stock shares, they should be looked at. So that was back in 2021. I assume you have been looking at it. Are you looking at wealth taxes to try and bolster?
We're not. And you'll know that I'm not going to sit here and pluck out figures out of nowhere when goodness knows what the state of the economy will be by the time of the next general election. We've been pretty honest where we do want to see increases in investment, where we'll get the money from. We've said that we'll scrap the non-dom tax status in order to fund the biggest workforce expansion in the NHS's history, 10,000 more nurses, doubling the number of medical school places, 5,000 more district nurses
You'll
to
forgive
keep
me
people
why I'm
at home.
sceptical that you're planning the biggest transformation since 1945 when the NHS was created if you're not saying that there's going to be any more money to fund it.
But whilst extra investment is essential, what I would argue here, Sophie, is reform is absolutely part of it too.
Sure.
That why have we got? But we have said where we'll increase funding to support.
3.2 billion from non-dom tax status.
Yes,
Taxing
now
private schools, 1.7 billion. I mean, this is not enough.
Well, I don't think money alone is the solution, and if you don't think 10,000 more nurses and doubling the number of medical spaces...
I'm questioning whether you can do a reform similar to 1945 when you're talking about, around £5-6 billion extra money.
But this is about reform. Why does a family have to ring 6 or 7 different numbers to try and get the services that their elderly parent needs. Why don't we have one team? Because there's one person and they don't see their needs in separate service silos. Reform can make a huge difference. If you look at delayed discharges from hospital, £1.7 billion spent last year on elderly people in hospital who didn't need to be there. Imagine the difference that could make if that was spent in the community or at home. Reform alongside investment is what we need to make the NHS fit for the future.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme. Liz Kendall there for the Labour Party. We were watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday, busy show this morning, NHS, G7 and, of course, lots on the latest Cyril Braverman allegations too. Still to come on the programme this morning. Next up, we're going to be talking to the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands and the former John Lewis boss, Andy Street. And a bit later on, we'll be hearing from the President of the British Chamber of Commerce and much more besides, Baroness Martha Lane-Fox. Well, regional mayors have become an increasingly important part of our politics, and especially, of course, with some of these new devolution deals expanding their powers. Well, Andy Street, a former John Lewis boss, has been the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands since 2017. Not a traditional Conservative heartland, fair to say, but he joins us now live. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning, Sophie.
I'm keen to get your view on all sorts of things, but just to start kind of big picture, the Conservatives have had a pretty disastrous set of local election results. There is a real challenge for Rishi Sunak at the next election. You, of course, represent an area where, you know, you're used to winning against Labour, you're used to fighting tight seats and scrapping for votes, if you like. What do you think the Conservative Party needs to do now?
To deliver on what it says it's going to do. And I don't just say that as a sort of glib response. I say it on the basis of very firm evidence. In the West Midlands, in the elections we had 3 weeks ago now, actually the Conservatives in the West Midlands Combined Authority area did not lose a single seat. We held 3 metropolitan councils. They're the only ones in the country. And the reason why, strong local leadership in those areas were delivering on what people wanted to see.
It's quite interesting when you say it's delivering on what you've said already, because there will be some people who say you've got to change the message. Look at what's just happened. The voters have basically sent a really big message that they're sick of what the Conservatives are doing. They don't like the direction of the government. Is it not time to change course?
No, definitely not. It's time to deliver on the 5 things the Prime Minister has said. And again, there's clear evidence on the ground that that's what people really are worried about. NHS waiting lists, as you've already been talking about. Of course, the migration statistics, as you've been talking about, but also all the underlying economic pieces. And my read of the results, actually, we had good results in the West Midlands, as I say, but across the country, there was no surge towards Labour. There was disenchantment from our voters, I accept that, but they're still waiting to see if we can turn it around in 18 months.
No surge towards Labour and still on course to win the next election.
Not necessarily. Many of the Sophists disagree with that. They did not do well enough to win the next election on those numbers. It was our voters saying we're not.
Maybe not to get a majority, but to win and to get into number 10.
In a sense, we're talking about the process. The question you asked me is what have we got to do? Deliver, and I'm saying our voters are still waiting to see if we can do that, and I'm very confident with time they will. Certainly, the direction of travel in terms of where we were last autumn and where the Prime Minister's now got us to is much better.
Let's talk house building.
Yes.
Because I know this is an area that you're very interested in, and it feels like there's a bit of a battle within the Conservative Party about what to do on house building, whether or not you should support local communities who are worried about developments on the green belt, whether or not actually the Conservatives needs to build houses to really help what many families are calling out for. Where do you sit?
So thank you for asking the question, because there's a story in the Sunday Times this morning.
Yes, that's partly why I'm trying to...
that tries to pitch me against the government. And frankly, I'm amazed that that's their take on it, because it's definitely not my view. The first thing to say is that the government is achieving much improved housing numbers compared to, dare I say it, the last Labour government. 232,000 homes last year, double the number in 2010. And the reason I think we've got something to say on this is that in the West Midlands uniquely, and the Times did confirm this, we're achieving our housing target numbers. And the way you do that is you do have to take tough decisions in favour of house building.
And so what's your message then? Because you say, look, you need to take this tough decision.
Yes.
And there are many MPs who would disagree with that on your side, that actually, look, we've got to listen to local communities. What's your message?
One of the tough decisions where we can definitely come together is about brownfield first. I have been absolutely robust about this over the last 7 years. So have our councils, cross-party in the West Midlands. And as a result of that, it is encouraging developers to attend to the tough sites in the brownfield areas. That's not an easy decision. It requires densification of our city centres. That's being done. And, of course, it requires a lot of public money to enable those brownfield sites to come back to use.
So green belt, if necessary?
Occasionally.
OK.
You can never say never. So let's give a good example. Huge investment going in around HS2 for the interchange station in Solihull. The council there are being very brave and say we will have development around that to make the most of it, but it is very much the exception to the rule.
If you don't get it right on house building, do you think that the Conservative Party risks alienating a whole group of voters, younger voters?
You can put it much more positively than that, actually. And it goes back to the first question as well. If I look at the councils where we did really well, we were demonstrably bringing derelict land back to life. We were building the homes. We were doing the regeneration of our town centres. And as a consequence, those young people see, yes, the Conservative Party is the party that delivers for us. And that's the opportunity for us.
You talk about the economy as well. And I want to talk a bit about migration, because net migration figures are out next week. They could hit 700,000. They're already at 500,000. Rishi Sunak says that's too high and that they need to come down. But, of course, if you look at the numbers, students, work visas, some would say that this is immigration that we need. What do you think?
So the answer is, again, it's not simple, but it's binary like that. We do need skilled migrants in some key areas. So one of the sectors that the government is talking a lot about at the moment is the new industrial sectors, such as the electric vehicle sector. We do need people to come with those skills. But we actually have to deal with the underlying issue about the lack of skills in our own population. So one of the other things we're absolutely focused on in the West Midlands is reskilling, retraining, and that's the real answer. Then you don't need to draw in people in the way in which historically we've been over-dependent.
The other thing that I think is one of those kind of big economic issues that's been wrestling with is our relationship with China. I was quite interested to hear Rishi Sunak this morning saying China poses the biggest danger of our age. Is he right, or do we actually need to do business with China?
So the answer's both. So let me just explain. Of course he's right when he says it's the biggest challenge of our age, because it's going to be the world's economic superpower. It is a superpower that, contrary to the relationship with the US that has been the superpower for the last 100 years, does not share our values. That is obvious. And so you do have to think, as a united West, how are we going to tackle that issue? My opinion is it does not mean you ostracise them completely and do not deal with them economically, but you have to be absolutely alert. So this question about critical national infrastructure, who's owning that, it's absolutely the right thing to call out, but it has to be a policy of engagement.
And what's your view on taxes as well? I know I'm doing kind of like a jump
everywhere,
around.
yes.
I'm still going everywhere. But, you know, it's rare that I get you in the studio, so I'm always keen to kind of pick your brains on stuff. What's your view on the levels of taxes? Historically, they're very high at the minute. Lots of disgruntlement among the Conservative Party. Do they need to come down, and which ones would you focus on?
So no one's questioning the fact that taxes are very high by historical standards. Why? Because we've come through a pandemic, have spent an enormous amount of money, you've got to adjust to that. But the sad lesson of last autumn is if you do it in an unplanned way, you just can't. Will be called out by the markets. So what the Chancellor said is right. He wishes to bring them down, will as soon as he can, as soon as the public finances improve. And where would you go first? I would definitely go to business taxation first, because actually you stand back and say, where's the growth in the economy going to come from? It is only through businesses investing. And so that, I think, is the right thing for him to have absolutely in his sights.
And when you say business taxes, corporation tax, or what, is there anything?
Corporation tax, business rates, still very challenging in many, many areas, business rates. And as the economy adjusts, there are areas that are really stranded with their business rates. So that's an area where I hope we can move. But investment allowances which are good. They could move even further, though.
It is, as you say, a very challenging time for businesses at the minute, including John Lewis, under quite a lot of pressure. I know you can. I'm always interested to get your views on, as a former boss of John Lewis, how difficult is the situation that it finds itself in?
Well, the situation's it's hard. I've 7 years since I left John Lewis. I'm now the champion of the West Midlands, not the champion of John Lewis. But never mind. I can give you a view. If you ask a straight question, you need a straight answer. So it's tough for retailers. Everybody knows that, but there are wonderful success stories. If I just look at Birmingham, we've got Sophy Ridge, we've got Primark, we've got Next, we've got Sports Direct, all with flagship shops. It can be done. And you just have to focus on delighting your customers. Sounds so simplistic, but in the good days of John Lewis, that is what was being done with the best product, the best service in the marketplace.
Now, just finally, and I know that you will have a reason to not know about this story. I wouldn't expect you to be texting Suella Braverman this morning to find out the truth of whether or not she did ask civil servants to organise the speed awareness course. But as a Conservative, you know, fighting in marginal areas for your position, how damaging are these stories to the brand of the Conservative Party?
You almost answer your own question, Sophie. I cannot possibly know about this. I've literally heard it this morning. But, I mean, the point is very simple. There have to be standards in public life. I'm not going to sit here and make a comment about the Home Secretary. I genuinely do not know. What I do know is the Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear that for him, standards in public life is an absolutely critical issue. I hope that's how I conduct myself. I hope that's how my party conducts itself. But there is no compromise over it because the public sniff out when you are not doing that. And if we serve the public, we have to reflect their best standards.
And, of course, he said, didn't he, promised a government of integrity.
He did. And he's been man to that.
Thank you very much indeed. Always really good to talk to you on the programme this morning.
Thank you very much.
Andy Street there, Mayor of the West Midlands. Now, Sinn Féin is for the first time the largest party in local government in Northern Ireland. The Nationalist Party gained an extra 39 council seats and demanded that power sharing should be restarted. Well, the Stormont Assembly has been suspended after the DUP walked away because of post-Brexit trading arrangements with the rest of the UK. Well, we can talk now to our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins. David, always such a pleasure to have you on the programme. Sinn Féin say the victory is historic. How significant is it?
Yes, good morning, Sophie. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to overstate the significance of this result for Sinn Féin. It's not just the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly at Stormont for the first time. It is now the largest party of local government for the first time, winning a record number of seats across 11 councils here, a greater number of seats than any party before it. Now, however you analyse that, it is a seismic shift in the political landscape of Northern Ireland and of this island when you consider that we now have a Sinn Féin First Minister designate at Stormont in the form of Michelle O'Neill, and given the polls south of the border, the very real potential for Mary Lou MacDonald to be the next Irish Prime Minister, the next Taoiseach. So if you had a Sinn Féin Taoiseach in Dublin and a Sinn Féin First Minister in Belfast, anyone suggesting that we're not witnessing historic change really is kidding themselves.
Absolutely historic, as you say. The key question that many people will be asking is whether this makes any difference at all to the running of Stormont. Do you think it could get back up and running?
Well, I'm going to hedge my bets and say probably, but it's not a foregone conclusion. And that's because this election was about Sinn Féin winning more than it was about the DUP losing. The DUP, despite predictions of meltdown in their vote over the boycott of power sharing at Stormont, held their own in most constituencies. In fact, they made some gains. The only reason Sinn Féin has done so well is that it has stolen so many seats from the moderate SDLP, the other nationalist party, a clear indication that nationalists are frustrated with the DUP for blocking Michelle O'Neill from holding the office of First Minister at Stormont. But Sinn Féin's not taking seats from the DUP, they're taking them from the other nationalist party. And the DUP will therefore argue that they still have a mandate for the hardline position they've adopted in opposition to post-Brexit trading arrangements.
And I just want to zoom out for a moment, if I may, because, as you say, it does feel quite extraordinary that we're now in a situation with Sinn Féin, the largest party in local government in Northern Ireland. Has there been a bit of a rebranding, I guess, of Sinn Féin under the leadership of Mary Lou MacDonald and Michelle O'Neill?
Oh, absolutely. Just think about the journey that the party has come on, led for 35 years by Gerry Adams, without question the world's most recognisable Irish Republican, and by Martin McGuinness, a self-confessed former IRA commander. But of course, he did cross the political Rubicon when he shared power with his political nemesis, the Unionist leader, the Reverend Ian Paisley, and historically reached out to shake hands with Her Majesty the Queen. But they've gone even further now, because those two men have been succeeded by two women, a complete rebrand for Sinn Féin. Mary Lou MacDonald in Dublin, Michelle O'Neill here in Belfast, and two women who are fronting much more populist social policies. So they're not just holding on to their Irish Republican base, they are appealing to a whole new generation of voters and to more moderate voters who perhaps recognise that Sinn Féin is in the process of fully moving away from its past 30 years ago. Some might say having completed the journey from the men with guns to the women in government.
Always really interesting to talk. As you say, a really extraordinary week in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much. David Blevins there. Now, we often, more often than we'd like, talk about bad behaviour by politicians on this programme, but the world of business has been rocked by allegations of misconduct by high-profile senior executives in recent years. This week, the chair of Tesco, John Allen, stepped down from one of the top jobs in British business following allegations just weeks after the Director-General of the UK's biggest business organisation, the CBI, was sacked. Well, we're joined now by Baroness Martha Fox, who is President of the British Chambers of Commerce. Thank you so much for being on the programme. You've had such an extraordinary CV and career, not just President of the British Chambers of Commerce, but you're the Chair of WeTransfer, Non-Executive Director of Chanel, Chancellor of the Open University, a serial entrepreneur who set up lastminute.com. Absolutely great to have you on. Lots that I want to talk to you about. But if I may, just to start with what's happening when it comes to the culture in business at the minute, because we have seen these very high-profile allegations. Is there a problem with the behaviour of senior people in business in the UK?
That's a big question. Good morning, Sophie. Lovely to be here. I think for me, it's a couple of things. You know, we clearly have now got the ability to have conversations and raise issues that perhaps before we brushed under the carpet, you know, as women, as people who felt vulnerable, minorities, whatever it might be. I do think, however, I've got to be careful to separate very, very serious allegations of rape and sexual misconduct from what might be determined as behaviour in the office that may be inappropriate, might be old-fashioned, might be much more complex to unpick. So I just think it's important to separate those different things. But to me, it's a big shift from when I first started in business, and you couldn't even say if you thought somebody was being a bit tricky with you or a bit inappropriate.
I can imagine that it must have been a big shift, and you're right that we are much more able to call out behaviour that is inappropriate now than perhaps previously. I mean, as you say, you've been in business for many years and you've probably witnessed or experienced stuff over your time there. Very feel free to share any experiences, but I understand if not. Do you think things are improving?
I think they are on one level, and I can tell you thousands of funny stories. I think everybody has probably had a story or something happened to them. Every woman in business, you know, everything from when we started lastminute.com, an investor, the only investor that would see me and Brent, the co-founder, for a meeting about whether or not to invest in our business. The first question, which he directed at Brent, was what happens if me, gets pregnant, which still shocks me now, 25, 30 years later. But I hear stories all the time of other people suffering way worse things than that. You know, I've had people call out my clothes, how I look all the time. You know, it's endless, isn't it? But I do think it's shifted. I do think it's much more careful in most business environments. And I think that we just have to recognise that, while people like me might still be very lucky and have the ability to say things are not quite right or call out somebody if they're bad behaviour, you know, we need to focus on the most vulnerable people in workplaces. If you're a contractor in a cleaning company working nights from a minority, I don't know whether power feels as though it's different for you. So I think it's really important we think about the whole spectrum of people who work and, as always, look after and protect the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, actually. And it is easy for women in high-profile positions to talk about things getting better. Is it getting better for the people who don't have the loudest voices, I think is the question, as you say, that we do need to keep asking. Exactly. There's been all sorts of allegations around the CBI, and I think you're right to say that it's important to say that there's a range of allegations here. Do you think that organisation is now finished?
You know, I don't know, and nobody wants to dance on another organisation's grave, especially when there have been some reports of bad behaviour. You know, what I would say is that at this moment in time, it's incredibly important to have the voice of business effectively talking into government. I'm president of the British Chambers of Commerce, as you said. We're a 160-year-old organisation with members from local communities. We've represented a national level and global network as well. And we had our conference this week on Wednesday, and we had the Chancellor there, we had the Governor of the Bank of England, we had Keir Starmer. So we are there, we are carrying on doing our job. And so the voice of business is being represented into government, and we feel really strongly that pre-election, with so much happening in the economy, that the government of all shades and of all sides are listening to what business has to say and their concerns about the next 18 months, 2 years.
What is your number one message to the government?
I think I'm going to be cheeky and kind of say two things. I think, firstly, it's incredibly important that government recognises business feels uncertain. Businesses are not looking ahead and thinking, "Yep, the economy feels robust," and "Yep, I feel confident in the political situation." As we've seen repeatedly, and all the data shows, whether it's data about business confidence, whether it's data about actual investment, businesses are waiting. They're kind of feeling a bit uncertain and holding back, and that's bad. We need business to feel confident, to feel as though there is stability, to feel as though they know what the shape of the next 2 years is going to be like, so that they can invest. That's fundamental. The second thing is around the people's crisis that we have in this country. We don't have enough people for the jobs that we want to do. We've got a million people who have vacancies in their business. It's the single biggest thing that I hear from talking to businesses all over the country in my role at British Chambers of Commerce. It's unbelievably complicated to find some people in some sectors, to then retain them, to retrain them, and so on. So I really do think it's a people's crisis, and I hope that the government and the opposition parties are listening to that, because it's the thing that people come back to again and again when I'm travelling around talking to businesses across the country.
It's really interesting to hear what you describe as a people's crisis at a time when there's a lot of focus on net migration figures out next week. Rishi Sunak says he wants them to come down. On this show a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to the former Bank of England chief economist, Andy Halliday, and he said that actually the government needs to alleviate some of those pressures through skilled, controlled migrant labour. Do you think he's right, that actually we need to embrace more immigration to try and fill some of those gaps?
I 100% do, and I think the businesses that we represent in the Chamber Network would say the same thing. We have some of the frameworks there already. We've got the frameworks around short-term contracting work for specially skilled jobs. They need to be expanded, ramped up, scaled up, and we won't be able to power up the economy in the way that I think is possible in this country if we don't have the people both in our country and outside our country. It's got to be both. It can't be one or the other. And if we shrink and we become closed, it's not going to be good for any of us, not for consumers, not for business leaders. It's really important that we address this incredible gap in skills that we have.
Is it made worse after leaving the European Union?
I think so, yes. I think it would be very tricky to argue that this has become an issue that we've sorted out internally, and I don't want to give the impression that anybody that I talk to believes we shouldn't be training up and working hard to make sure that the people in this country have the skills we need as well. They do need to happen in parallel. We need to make sure we've got skilled workers from overseas. We also need to make sure that we're helping our own citizens and employees become as skilled as possible. I'm also Chancellor of the Open University. I see this time and time again how people are using that organisation to skill up in their work and move on in their careers. And it's vital that we have dual track in this in order to address the enormous challenges that we face over the next decade.
It's interesting you mentioned the universities there as well, because it does feel that this is another part of the political debate about whether the rules should be tightened on international students and the time that they can stay in the UK after finishing a course. Do you think that's something the government could look at?
Sorry, you slightly cut out there, Sophie, so I hope I'm answering the right question. But I heard you talk about universities, and I agree. I think we also think at the Open University that it's super important that we keep open and bring in people to study and keep that richness of our Open University, but also the wider university network. We just don't want to become a closed country. Whatever you feel about the Brexit debate, I think that it's really important that Britain still feels as though it's a place that has these centres of excellence, that is encouraging people from all over the world to come in and out of our country, to see the incredible university network that we have and use it and feel part of it, because that's an incredible soft power that we'll have over the world when we keep those borders open. So from every angle, I think we would argue that for all the institutions that I'm lucky enough to represent, that an open Britain is a very important player on the world stage. We mustn't become too closed.
Politics is already kind of gearing up for an election next year, and it feels like there's a bit of a tussle between Labour and the Conservatives over who is the party for business. Who do you think is coming out on top at the minute?
I think it was ever thus. I mean, I think the great thing is that both parties are talking actively about business and the importance of engaging with businesses. 30% of the people in this country work in businesses. They fuel our economy. We're not going to have any of the ability to deliver services and the things that we want to do if we don't have a robust economy, and that's driven by business. So it was fantastic that both Keir Starmer and Jeremy Hunt and Andrew Bailey were at our conference at the BCC on Wednesday. All of them are talking about the importance of business. Everybody's talking about growth. As always, we want to see the action behind that. We want to feel as though it's not just noise, but it's also followed through with action. As I talked about, making that business environment feel certain, making sure that we've got the skills we need, helping businesses trade internationally and so forth. There's a bunch of stuff that needs to happen as well as the rhetoric. But the first point is clearly to make sure that parties are listening and engaging, and that's 100% happening.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting to talk to you about a whole range of things this morning, so thank you for being on the programme.
Of course.
That was Baroness Martha Lane Fox talking to the programme. Now, we talked quite a lot recently about AI, artificial intelligence, if I can get my words out. Just a few weeks ago on the programme, we had a stark warning from one of the world's leading AI computer scientists about some serious risks. And now a group of school leaders have set out their fears about the threat it poses to education, including leading state and private school heads and university leaders. Now, they've been led by the renowned historian and the head of Epsom College, Sir Anthony Seldon, who joins us now. Thank you very much for being on the programme. What is the threats of AI when it comes to education?
So can I just hear that question again? Sorry, just a bit more clearly. There was some noises
of course.
off there.
Apologies for the disruption. What is the threat of artificial intelligence to education?
Well, I think there are many more opportunities, unrivaled opportunities to give all young people, regardless of the schools they're in and the parts of the country they're in, and indeed the learning difficulties that they might have, extraordinary opportunities for enrichment, for real-time assessment and marking, to free up teachers to spend much more time with young people, because a lot of the heavy lifting will be done by the machines. But there are also very real risks, risks of obviously plagiarism, risks that all the difficult parts will be taken over by the technology, which is only in its infancy at the moment. The rate of change is going to be incredible over the next 5 and 10 years, as we've already seen. And fear of deep fakes, of moral damage to young people, which is already quite considerable with social media, will be magnified because of the extraordinary pace of change. And schools, teachers, parents, we're all bewildered.
It's interesting to use that word. You talked there about the use of deep fakes. Is that something that you're seeing in your schools amongst young people? Like, it almost feels to me like another tool of bullying that people could use.
Yeah, I mean, it is extremely invidious and dangerous how manipulating the technology can be, because it will understand. I mean, as we know, when we're shopping, when we're looking on the internet, the personalization of the material that comes to us will become far, far more sophisticated. And young people are young. They can't negotiate the world very well. And so the opportunity for them to be manipulated, bullied, brought into practices, drugs, all the rest of it, is very worrying to parents, very worrying to schools. So what we're saying is, look, the edtech companies have a lot of profit motive. They're making enormous amounts of money out of the technology, that we can't make them go away. We have to ensure that we provide parents, schools, teachers with really good information about what is wholesome, stimulating, good AI, and what people should be aware of. Because government, who've really have caught up in the last few months, but they're still behind the curve, and they never quite understand what happens in schools. Parliament doing some good work, but they take a lot of time to come out, with their statutes and recommendations. We have to take it into our own hands, schools, to ensure that human intelligence is at the very heart of schools. Artificial intelligence will never take over from humans as long as we put human intelligence first and don't just try teaching young people with tests and exams in a way that is giving them the skills that the algorithms will always be better. As Martha Lane Fox was talking about, we need the skills in this country. The skills are the interpersonal skills, the human skills, the problem solving, the entrepreneurial skills, which are not being sufficiently done in schools because we're just narrowing everything down to exams. So I think that there's a lot here that is enormously exciting, but we have to get ahead of it in the interests of the children and the many, not the few, parents, teachers.
You mentioned the interview with Martha Lane Fox. She was also very strongly saying that the government shouldn't be looking at international students to try and get net migration figures down. What's your view on that?
Well, I think universities are doing, I would do, wouldn't I? I used to be a vice-chancellor. Are doing a superb job. Government have failed to provide the leadership of the sector. Universities should be right at the very heart of that drive for productivity that Martha was talking about. But if without a more benign attitude from government, if government stays obsessed by numbers of overseas students who so enrich this country and the economy and Britain's relations with the world, it's just looking at the wrong thing. Government really isn't smart about the leadership of education.
That's interesting.
In either higher education or school education. They're obsessed by narrow data, whether immigration numbers or whether exam results. They really don't get what education is all about. And they certainly don't get AI sufficiently yet.
That's really interesting to hear your thoughts on it. I'm interested, as the head of Epsom College, because there has been a bit of a debate about private schools, particularly among the Labour Party. Keir Starmer saying that he would abolish the charitable status of private schools, levy VAT on fees. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that this initiative here that we're talking about is cross-sector between, it's jointly led by Epsom and by a multi-academy, trust-born academy, is the example of collaborative work between independent and state schools, which I think is the model for the future. Personally, I don't think that getting rid of independent schools or putting so much financial squeeze on them will actually help state schools. I think working together side by side is the way forward. And I think that is what we'll see, because if independent schools have to close, there simply aren't the places in the state schools to take all those young people. So let's have a much more imaginative policy from government and a much more forward-thinking policy for government. And let's see both sides of that education divide working much more closely together. That's always what I've wanted to see.
You think there's a genuine risk of independent schools closing then?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be particularly those which are serving areas where there's lesser income, where the fees are already lower, where the margins are much tighter, and where those schools are really serving their communities and giving parents another choice. I think it's good that we don't have a uniform education system, that there is choice and diversity within it. I think that is a strength of the British education system. It's why overall and historically we've had such a good education system. So, who will see? Look, Labour out of power before 1945, before 1964, before 1997 has always made threatening noises about wanting to get rid of independent schools. And of course I understand that argument. But when it gets into power and the practicalities bite in, that they do other things and that they go off in other areas. I think much better to try and raise the standards of all state schools, not the least by government understanding what AI is and how it can give a top quality education to all, and to have both sectors working together. I think that's a better way myself.
And just finally, you talked a bit about the choice that parents have. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, said she wouldn't send her children to private school because she wants them, in her words, to see the world as it is. Do you think she's got a point?
Yeah, I think that a lot of Labour ministers historically have always sent their children to independent schools. There are some superlative state schools. I think the best of state schools are better than independent schools, but I think also that's a little bit unfair to some incredibly imaginative independent schools, which are doing things to stretch and give their young people opportunities, which there simply isn't the time often in a state school to do. But look, that's her choice. She's exercising her choice. Good for her. And personally, we send our children at different times to both state and to independent schools. We have a fantastic state sector, which has got better and better.
Thank you so much for being on the programme. It's been really fascinating to hear your views, and I think the warning on artificial intelligence, to government and also to the companies is one that's very timely indeed.
Very real, very real.
Thank you. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. But in a moment after the break, we'll be running through today's interviews. We'll be joined by our political correspondent, Liz Bates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello, welcome back. This is Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take, a chance for us to look back at our interviews this morning on the programme, work out what we've learned, what it means for the week ahead. We're joined today with our political correspondent, Liz Bates. But just to start off, because it was one of these programmes where, you think you know what you're going to be asking about. You think it's going to be all about the G7, perhaps on Ukraine, and obviously there was questions on that. But then you had the sort of bombshell Sunday Times story about Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, and the allegation that she asked civil servants to help set up a private speed awareness course to try and avoid having points on her licence. Now, it's one of these things where you kind of know that the minister on the programme is going to try and dodge the question, and the challenge as an interviewer is to try and pin them down, or at least to try and hold them to account on why they don't have the answers. Let's have a quick listen, shall we, to Therese Coffey, the Environment Secretary, what she had to say when I asked her about those allegations.
It's perfectly normal nowadays if people are found speeding to be offered points or to go on a course of some kind. So as I say, I don't know the details that are referred to in the newspaper, but I think, as far as I'm aware, the Home Secretary's just decided to take the points, pay the penalty, and keep focused on her main job of security, but also tackling illegal migration.
Do you have the Home Secretary's phone number?
Do I have her phone number? I probably do somewhere.
Why didn't you message her then?
Well, because I think it's a case of there's some speculation in the newspaper. I'm not going to get into individual details. As far as I'm aware, there's people close to the message or whoever, the press. But, candidly, this is just a case of something that happened, I guess, over a year ago. I don't quite know the details. I can only read I'm only aware of what was in the newspaper.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Liz Bates, shall we? I mean, look, I guess I was kind of expecting her to be like, look, I don't know the details. But I was quite struck by just how far she went in that, saying, yeah, I have a number, but I don't want to message someone at 7:20 in the morning. It's like, well, it is the Home Secretary being accused of something that is potentially quite serious, no?
Yeah. And it was quite extraordinary, I thought, that exchange, because this is something that we saw over and over again, particularly under the Boris Johnson administration, which was, and I know that you tried to come up with different questions at the time to try and get at some of those issues, which is why you asked Therese Coffey this morning about whether she had Suella Braverman's phone number. We see ministers coming on these programmes and saying, well, I don't know anything about it. And I think you're completely right to say, well, why can't you text her? And her defence for that seemed to be that maybe it was too early on a Sunday morning, and even maybe the suggestion that the Home Secretary isn't up on a Sunday morning reading some of the newspapers that she's on the front of. And I think this is an issue that we have to get around with ministers, because they come on these programmes to be accountable for what's going on in government. And I think it's time to, if we can, to end that practice of just saying, I don't know anything about it, I'm just reading it in the newspapers, like everybody else, especially because Rishi Sunak really drew a line in the sand, I think, on this issue himself. This didn't come from us, this came from him. He said this was going to be a government and a premiership that was centred around integrity and professionalism and high standards. And so I think ministers need to be more accountable for that.
Yeah, it's also this sort of frustration where I think at one point she was like, look, you just making all these allegations. It's like, I'm actually genuinely just trying to find out what happened. Because the statement from Suella Braverman also doesn't address this. It just says that she took the points. And at one point, Therese Coffey was trying to say, I think, look, she just was trying to get on a speed awareness course. This happens all the time. She took points. This happens all the time. But that's not the allegation, is it? That's not the central allegation. It's that she talked to civil servants.
No. And I think we can see quite clearly already what the line from the government is, because this is a line that's come from Suella Braverman, which is, it happened, I've dealt with it. And Therese Coffey had the same line as well. She's accepted what's happened and she's paid the fine, taken the points. The Prime Minister said it as well this morning. This line is not going to hold because it's answering a different question. Nobody is accusing her of speeding. It's quite clear that that happened. It is the possibility that she approached civil servants, which is entirely inappropriate, on a matter like this to try and bend the rules for herself. That's the question that they need to answer. And look, there is a process, there's a ministerial code, there's an ethics advisor, there is ways to get to the bottom of this, and I think the government will be facing many more questions on this. I don't think this line I don't think they can keep trotting out this line.
Can I ask you a bit of a bubble question, a Westminster bubble question? The timing of this happened last year. It's been leaked the Sunday before the net migration figures come out, which is going to be a really difficult time for the Home Secretary, right? Really difficult time, perhaps her hardest week. I mean, that looks a bit deliberate, doesn't it?
In what sense?
Well, someone's got it in for her.
Yes, I mean, look, I think there's always a possibility of that. Whenever, a lot of the time in Westminster, when stories get leaked to journalists, it's not always purely for public good. Sometimes there are political reasons behind it. In the end, it doesn't matter because these things must come to light. It's important for standards in public life. But yes, I think the timing is potentially a bit suspicious.
Raise my eyebrow. Although, as you say, it's clearly a public interest story, an important story to come out. No one is questioning that. But it did just make me think slightly. Now, Labour are calling for an investigation into whether the Home Secretary broke the ministerial code. Shadow Health Minister Liz Kendall says that if she has, it wouldn't be entirely surprising.
I think Rishi Sunak should launch an investigation into it. He should ask the independent advisor whether she's breached the standards of the ministerial code here. I think a lot of people watching this programme will think, you know, why is it always one rule for them and another rule for everybody else? But, you know, Suella Braverman's got form on this, hasn't she? You'll remember she actually had to resign as Home Secretary under Liz Truss because she sent confidential documents to a Tory MP when she shouldn't have done that. And Rishi Sunak reappointed her as Home Secretary. Why? Because he had to keep the right wing of his party on board. So there's no point in him getting all tetchy at the G7 press conference. It's because of him that she's there. So I've got my own views about that sort of behaviour, but actually what he should do is launch an investigation to make sure we get to the bottom of this.
I mean, it's an open goal for Labour, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think that Liz Kendall is kind of touching on something which is quite obvious, which is, look, it's not I don't think anybody thinks that it's a perfect fit, Suella Braverman, in Rishi Sunak's cabinet, but she backed him in the leadership contest. He made her Home Secretary. To some extent, he really needs her, especially at the moment, off the back of the local elections. He's looking on shaky ground, I think, within his party. There are grumblings, there are tensions, and what she does is she secures the backing of that wing of the party that has been very difficult and has made problems for previous governments, the ERG. And so I think that is why he will back her in this scenario. And as Liz Kendall said, you know, she had form at the time. She'd only just broken the ministerial code at the time when he brought her back into cabinet. So I think this is going to be a tricky political issue for him.
It's true, and it's quite important to reflect that, isn't it? I think that often, you know, in London or in kind of Westminster bubble, whatever, you end up saying that, look, everyone thinks that Suella Braverman is unpopular, no one backs her, why is she in cabinet? But actually, if you look at Conservative members, she's very popular.
Yes, she's very popular within the Conservative Party, in a specific wing within the Conservative Party, and that is why I think Rishi Sunak will try to hang on to her, and I think we'll see this playing out. But as I said, again, there are competing ends here, because he did set himself the task of running a very different type of government when it came to these types of issues. And you saw him, he'd be very decisive previously on Nadeem Zahawi when it came to his financial issues, on Dominic Raab and the bullying report that came out. So we'll see whether he's prepared to take action and just launch an investigation or ask his ethics advisor on this issue with Suella Braverman, or if politics will trump the kind of high standards in public life that he said that he's going to go forward with.
It's interesting, Liz was just talking there about the kind of competing sort of factions and wings in the Conservative Party, and I have to say, we spoke to the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, on the programme today, and we asked him about Suella Braverman. Just have a listen to what he said. I think this is quite interesting.
I mean, the point is very simple. There have to be standards in public life. I'm not going to sit here and make a comment about the Home Secretary. I genuinely do not know. What I do know is the Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear that for him, standards in public life is an absolutely critical issue. I hope that's how I conduct myself. I hope that's how my party conducts itself. But there is no compromise over it, because the public sniff out when you are not doing that. And if we serve the public, we have to reflect their best standards.
I mean, he said he wasn't commenting directly on the Home Secretary, but that was quite punchy, I thought, actually.
Yes, I think he went in a completely different direction from Therese Coffey, and it doesn't take much to read between the lines of that to say that he is on the side of going down a different route, which is potentially kind of looking into the type of behaviour that has gone on here. What we see when it comes to the mayors is that they do have a bit more scope to kind of freelance on these issues. And as he said, he's not in cabinet. He's not going to see Suella Braverman. He may not even have her phone number to ask her, but he is taking a different approach. And I think for Andy Street, that will be about what voters think. Yeah. You could see him there saying, people can sniff this out. And I think certainly under Boris Johnson, these issues were muddier. The ministerial code, the ethics advisor, the way that he approached these issues with his cabinet ministers. And Andy Street is of the view that things need to be different under Rishi Sunak. So you could see him sort of gently shoving him in that direction.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I always enjoy talking to him because he is someone who's very deeply connected with a very marginal area of the country. And he was saying correctly that actually the Conservatives did outperform, low baseline obviously, but in the West Midlands compared to elsewhere at those local elections.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for the analysis on Suella Braverman, Liz. Now, another really big talking point at the moment on the show this morning is migration, with those figures that we're expecting next week and reports suggesting that net migration could top a record-breaking 700,000 people. Therese Coffey didn't share her thoughts on what the actual number might be ahead of it coming out. Let's listen.
I'm not going to speculate on what statistics may be coming. I think there are two key points that I'd like to make, which are that since leaving the European Union, we now control, through an Australian-style points-based system, the criteria for people coming into this country who don't already have the opportunity to do so. We've also opened our doors to people from Hong Kong, from Ukraine, in really difficult circumstances. So the point is, the rules are there if we decide that we want to change the rules in the future. But overall, the Prime Minister has been clear. He wants to reduce overall numbers on legal migration. But the main focus right now is actually on tackling the illegal immigration.
Well, let's bring in Liz. Rishi Sunak has always talked about his 5 pledges, and a lot of them are quite easy, like inflation, for example. That's going to come down, all the experts are saying, this year anyway. But when it comes to his comments on migration, that's actually very difficult to do, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can see again and again, Rishi Sunak is doing it and his ministers are doing it as well. They're wanting to talk about illegal migration, I think because they feel that in the time frame they have until the next general election, that could be an easier issue to tackle, especially when you look at the figures on legal migration. But look, this is a political issue that the Conservative Party have made many pledges on in the past, and I think it's fair to say have used in the past to appeal to voters. So they can't really shy away from it now that the figures are going in the wrong direction. I think you could see playing out there with Therese Coffey what is probably going on in Cabinet, which is the practicality of bringing down these immigration numbers at the same time as competing goals in other sections of government. In particular, you look at the economy, it's quite clear that there are huge gaps in the workforce, and we need workers to do those jobs, and training people domestically is something that takes a long time compared to having foreign workers do those jobs. And I think if you look at Rishi Sunak's goals on growth, he wants to bring down inflation, all of those things really rely on filling those skills gaps. And even Therese Coffey said, look, we have gaps in the agricultural sector. We need people to work now. And I think that is the tension that is going on behind the scenes.
And it's interesting because on the programme as well, we spoke to Sir Anthony Seldon in the education sector and Baroness Martha Lane-Fox in the economic sector, and they're both saying, look, we really need these people to come over, whether it is international students in our universities, whether it is workers to fill some of the vacancies in the job markets. Not an easy balance. No. And yet, if you listen to Labour, they're actually saying kind of a similar thing. I thought Liz Kendall went further than I thought she would, saying that she wanted, or Labour would like to see net migration coming down too.
I expect it to come down, and it should come down. And I think the real issue here is this, that in Labour's points-based immigration system, we have to tie up what we're seeing in terms of a skills gap in our population and actually put in place the programmes to deal with that so that we don't have to have the work visas that we're seeing at the moment. I mean, just look at health and social care. That is the area where the highest number of visas are being issued at the moment. But what does the government do? It cuts medical school places this year by 3,000.
So that was Liz Kendall's view. I also asked the same question to Andy Street about whether there's an argument that higher migration could be a positive thing for the economy.
We do need skilled migrants in some key areas. So one of the sectors that the government is talking a lot about at the moment is the new industrial sectors, such as the electric vehicle sector. We do need people to come with those skills. But we actually have to deal with the underlying issue about the lack of skills in our own population. So one of the other things we're absolutely focused on in the West Midlands is reskilling, retraining, and that's the real answer.
Well, let's bring Liz back in. I mean, the round's just going to reignite, isn't it, next week?
Yes, I think it is. And I do think it's quite interesting, the Labour Party's position. We see this time and again. I mean, it's almost that they've taken the government's basically the government's exact same position, which is they want to see net migration figures come down, but it's quite tricky at the moment because of the workplace needing extra staff, and their basic position is we will do it better. And I thought, you know, Liz Kendall brought up another area where we are struggling for domestic workers in the NHS, but Labour's plans will take a long time. So they are in exactly the same position as the government, and I don't think they have a policy that will sort of be a game changer on this.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I did actually think she might not be quite as direct, because quite often with these direct questions about should migration be higher or lower, I've struggled to get a response, but it did feel that actually she was being quite firm, saying that we would like to see lower levels of migration.
Yes, and I think the Labour Party has in the past had a difficult relationship with migration, and so they have taken this position that they want to say to voters, you know, we'll bring migration figures down as well. But I think they're in the same position as the government. They don't want to put a figure on it. They see that the graph is going up almost exponentially, and it's quite easy for them, you know, a couple of years out of a general election to say we'd like to see it go in a different direction without any real solid plans to do it, certainly in the short term.
That's true. We might see a few more solid plans, I guess, on the NHS. We'll have to wait for those as well. Thank you very much indeed, Liz, on the programme this morning. Always good to talk to you. And we'll have more from Liz as well, because our podcast, the show podcast, best bits of the interviews, plus analysis from me, Liz, and Scott Beasley, a show editor, that will be out later on today as well. Busy week, and I have a feeling that next week is going to be a pretty busy one as well, with those all-important net migration figures coming out too. Thanks very much for watching this morning. We'll be back on Wednesday night for The Take with Sophy Ridge, and then, of course, on Sunday as well. Have a great rest of your weekend.